Vampires have been a part of cinema for over 100 years, and what seems to make them so enduring is their range. One minute they're terrifying monsters, the next they're dripping with sensuality. They even show up in comedies that shouldn't work, but they somehow do. This horror subgenre, the vampire movie, has always had this wild ability to tap into your fear, desire, and even dark humor all at once. The kind of modern resurgence as of late with films like Robert Eggers' Oscar-nominated Nosferatu, and of course the current talk of the town, Ryan Coogler's Sinners, has been the inspiration and the springboard for me to do my next ranking. This time around, it's the top 10 vampire movies.
I am Dracula, and I welcome you to my house.
What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the garage. Gerald here with you, of course, and it's time for another ranking, another countdown. This is my own personal ranking for my favorite vampire movies, and I'm speaking about all time. Although when I get into my list, you'll see that most of the ones that I'm drawn to that I rewatch frequently are pretty recent. I mean, there's going to definitely be some representation from the 1980s on this list. But in terms of going back pre-1980s, while there are some that I absolutely adore from those eras, I don't necessarily rewatch them and I wouldn't categorize them as my personal favorites. The recent success, as I'm sitting here recording, for Ryan Coogler's Sinners, starring Michael B. Jordan, Haley Steinfeld, Delroy Lindo, and many others. I think the vampire movie is having a bit of a resurgence right now in the last couple years. However, it's never really left the horror genre or the zeitgeist. It is always top of mind when you're talking of the subgenres in horror that are like household commonplace monsters or beings. There's usually vampires, werewolves, creatures or monsters, aliens. Those subgenres are not going anywhere. They'll always be around. So the challenge for filmmakers and for actors portraying vampires is how do they bring something new to it? How do they make it fresh and inventive and not just a tired old trope? So I'm going to be going back and forth with my glasses. So I'm sorry for the Coke bottles. And I also should have went reflection free, but I didn't opt for that. So let's get into the list. I want to start out with some honorable mentions. I'll just run through these real quick. These are the 5 that just missed making my top 10, but I absolutely love these films. They're near misses for me. Shadow of the Vampire from the year 2000. This is a movie about the making of the 1922 film Nosferatu. I talked a little bit about my cold open about how the vampire genre can do comedy right. It can be dark comedy or it can be kind of slapsticky. And that's what we got in 1985 with a film called Once Bitten. It stars Jim Carrey right before he literally exploded with films like Ace Ventura, The Mask, and even his turn on In Living Color, which came a little bit after this. A lot of people may be surprised that this is not in the top 10, but I'm going to throw in my honorable mentions here. 1996's From Dusk Till Dawn from Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino. This is a film that has very similar plot developments to a movie like Sinners. Salma Hayek will be embedded in my brain forever as a young dude when I saw this movie. I love it. You'll just see when we get to my top 10, there's so many movies that are so near and dear to my heart in this genre. How about an early entry into Catherine Bigelow's directorial career? And that's with 1987's Near Dark. Another great cast in this one. Bill Paxton, of course, is so memorable in this role. Lance Henriksen. It's a cool kind of, it's almost like Grease, like the musical Grease, but told from a vampire perspective. That's always what I kind of equated it to in my mind. And then, of course, few people did Dracula as well as Christopher Lee. And I'm going to go with 1958's Dracula, starring Christopher Lee as the Count. Peter Cushing, of course, is Van Helsing. This is an absolute classic. Falls under the Universal monster movies of the old days. I love it so much. Dracula is going to come up again in my top 10. All right, with those honorable mentions out of the way, let's get into my top 10 with my number 10 from 2014. It is an indie film called A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. So when I was doing this list and I was coming up with narrowing it down to my top 10, I purposefully wanted to put a few entries into my top 10 that I'm going to talk a little bit about and show some clips from, hopefully, that are lesser seen films, maybe lesser known. Maybe you haven't even heard of a couple of these. This one I feel like is tremendously underseen and underappreciated. There's this really rundown Iranian town that's depicted in the film, which, by the way, is shot in black and white, which adds to kind of an eerie, just unfamiliar element that we get with this movie. But there's a girl who suffers from depression and loneliness, and she essentially has those afflictions because she's a vampire and because she's undead, and she does not want to be, but it's by no choice of hers, and she just is. So the movie is essentially her dealing with that, and the way she works through that is by stalking townspeople and killing them because she has to survive. But even though she has very little dialogue and she's doing these atrocious things on camera and off camera, you still somehow connect to her, and you still, in an odd way, kind of root for her because of the loneliness and just the seclusion that she feels because of this affliction that she has, almost like it's a disease that can't be cured. Beautiful movie. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night from 2014 is highly underseen in my opinion. Check it out. My number 9, don't judge, Buffy the Vampire Slayer from 1992. Let's fucking go, guys. This movie has such a high rewatchability for me. I just introduced my 11-year-old son to this last October for Halloween season. So it stars Kristy Swanson, who's a bit of almost like one of the Mean Girls from the Mean Girl movies, or Alicia Silverstone from Clueless, like that type of character where she's kind of like, seems like a blonde bimbo, and that's kind of how she's portrayed. And obviously she's very beautiful and sexy in the movie. So she's the head cheerleader, and she just kind of has that aura and talks like a valley girl throughout the movie. And she's basically tasked with killing vampires that have come to LA to murder high school kids because they need virgin blood. Rutger Hauer is the head vampire, essentially like a Dracula figure. Paul Rubens, Pee Wee Herman, plays his second in command, kind of his handler, and he is freaking hilariously phenomenal in this. One of the greatest death scenes in all of movies is his death in this movie. And it's not even like a death scene. It's played for comedy and over-the-top campiness. And he just keeps acting like he's dying, and you think he's dead, and then he comes back, and like they do that whole shtick. This was one of the first times I ever remember seeing that.
Oh! Ow!
If for some reason you haven't seen 92's Buffy the Vampire Slayer with Kristy Swanson, seek it out. It is hilarious and such a fun ride. I love this movie. My number 8 is 30 Days of Night from 2007. This is a film that's directed by David Slade that when it came out in 2007, I remember thinking for a brief moment, that might be the best vampire movie I've ever seen. Just because the premise is perfect. And I think this is based on previous material, maybe a book or a graphic novel. I'm not entirely sure, but I don't think it was a wholly original idea for Slade. However, the premise I had not thought of prior to seeing this movie, but certain areas of the world, it's dark for multiple months a year and they just don't see the sun. So that's what's happening in this town. 30 days, it's going to be dark. So that sucks in and of itself. And then on top of that, oh, by the way, vampires know that, and they've migrated to this town because they know they're not going to have to worry about the sun hurting them. So think of all the different scenarios in vampire movies where if you just make it through the night, if we can just make it till the sun comes up, we'll be good. We can develop a plan when the sun's up, or we can use the sun to kill these fuckers, or whatever. Not in 30 Days of Night. It is a very harrowing, brutal depiction of vampires as well. This was the first time that I can remember, at least in cinema, where they were like almost zombie-esque. They were very non-sexual, which vampires had typically been that way. Josh Hartnett, who's having a bit of a renaissance right now, this is one of my favorite roles of his before he kind of went on hiatus. But 30 Days of Night is a very eerie, brilliant setting for a vampire movie, and I just remember being floored by that because I was like, man, this is perfect. Why didn't anybody think of this before? And of course they probably had, and I just wasn't familiar with it. But 30 Days of Night would fall at my number 8. Being that this is in the zeitgeist right now, it literally just came out a week ago. Not even. As I'm recording, it came out like 5 days ago. But I'm going to put at my number 7, and I want you guys to think about what I'm saying. I'm the horror guy. I love this genre of film. I love vampires. I love cinema in general. The fact that I would put this in my top 10 when it just came out 5 days ago should say a lot to you. My number 7 is Ryan Coogler's Sinners. I did a full review of this movie. I also did a second follow-up video talking about Sinners' Oscar prospects for next award season. I'll tag both of those on this video for you if you want to hear me talk a little bit more about this movie. But in short, the filmmaking and the artistry on display with this film is really what catapulted this into my top 10 vampire movies. It's kind of weird too because the vampire portion of this story doesn't really show up until the second half of the movie, maybe even a little bit later than that. But once it does, Coogler takes these traditional cliched tropes of inviting them in, and the sun that we were just talking about a minute ago. The garlic is prominent in this film as a weapon towards the vampires. And the vampires show up and they say, look, you can't have this space. You can't have your own thing. We're going to take it. You don't deserve it because you're black. That's what we think. But the vampires don't necessarily think that way. They more so are just out for blood. But they represent the racism and the inherent racism that exists with all the white folks in that town. You know, the Ku Klux Klan is depicted in the movie. So I love this symbolism, and I love that Coogler used such a embedded piece of cinematic history to tell this story. Guys, check out my full review if you want to hear me talk a little bit more about Sinners. But frankly, I'm actually surprised that it cracked my top 10 vampire movies when I was ranking them. But here we are. My top 6, they're literally all tied. I'm going to start at number 6 with another 80s throwback from 1985, Tom Holland's Fright Night. Holy shit, guys. Brewster, you're so cool, man. This is another high school, kind of like dark comedy. Not as slapsticky as a movie like Buffy that I mentioned earlier, but it definitely has those high school comedy elements to it. But another brilliant premise. This high school kid lives across the street from a new resident that's moving into the mansion across the street, up the street. And it turns out the guy moving in there is a vampire. And the kid that lives that kind of, has an affinity for horror movies and watches a weekly series called Fright Night with a character that is very reminiscent of like a Vincent Price character. So he's obsessed with kind of horror. He has horror movie posters, and he convinces himself that Jerry Dandridge that moved in across the street is a vampire. I'm convinced of it. So he tries to tell his friends, tries to tell his mom. They all think he's crazy because he loves horror. He's just making this shit up in his head. And it becomes a beautiful setting and a perfect setup that it turns out that Jerry actually is a vampire. And then once Jerry knows that they know, and it's the cat's out of the bag, if you will, Chris Sarandon, this might be the coolest version of a vampire in my top 10. The dude just oozes sexuality, coolness. I mean, it's almost like you want him to turn you just because he's so alluring and so magnetic in the role. And there's a couple scenes that really spoke to his charm and charisma, particularly the nightclub scene, which is one of my favorites. So let's give it up for Fright Night. I freaking love this movie. Another one that I could rewatch every week for the rest of my life, which is the case with the rest of these on the list. But Fright Night falls at my number 6. Man, can't believe it's number 6. Let's keep going. So much like I said earlier with A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, here's another one that I want to shout out that I absolutely adore this movie. It's the brilliant filmmaker Park Chan-wook, who I think might get some recognition, hopefully this Oscar season, for his new film, No Other Choice. This is one of his earlier works in the horror genre, and it's called Thirst from 2009. So beautiful, guys. When you think of the old school, vintage, Renaissance, Transylvania-esque style vampire settings, this one has that feeling, that aura and atmosphere, but it's a South Korean film. The general premise of this is there's a priest in this town who finds out he has a deadly virus, and there's an experimental cure that's kind of being talked about that could cure his virus and other people that have it. So he decides to basically be a test dummy for the cure, so that's the only way he's going to save his life anyway. So they give him the vaccine or whatever, but it doesn't work and it kills him and he dies. So then there's some supernatural elements kind of introduced to the story, because this kind of mysterious young girl, we find out who she is a little bit later in the story, but she gives him a blood transfusion and he comes back to life because of the transfusion that she gave him. Now, when he comes back to life, it's very mysterious for us for like an hour. Like, we're really kind of like, how did that happen? Are they going to explain it? The priest kind of starts to kind of distance himself from those like religious views. And instead, he almost begins to start worshiping this young girl that was his blood donor. And he's very drawn to her, and she becomes almost like a master to him. You probably know where I'm going with this. And he just craves being around her versus anything else that he was into before he came back to life. This one, probably more than any other one on my list, makes it a very human, like real people, if they were to turn vampires. If there was a preacher in your town that this happened to, this is probably the way he would act, not, you know, some of the more supernatural, extracurricular stuff that we see with all the different cliches. This is just a dude who doesn't know why he's back to alive again. And on top of that, he doesn't know why he can't leave this girl alone. He's just drawn to her. And we're kind of thinking the same thing. This movie's so good, and it is so underseen. My number 4 is the Swedish film from 2008, Let the Right One In. Another very unique spin on this genre, okay? Because we do have vampires in it. We do have blood sucking. We do have murder as victims for food. But told so poetically and so beautifully, where you go, yeah, that makes sense. I'll kill for you. I'll bring you a body. Absolutely. There was a remake of this that Matt Reeves did actually just a year after this one came out. That's also really, really good. That one's just called Let Me In. If you're in America, you may have seen that version. This is the original from Sweden. One of my favorite scenes in any movie in the last like 25 years is the swimming pool scene in this movie, where he is saved by her against these bullies that are bullying him at the pool. And it's just so minimalistically shot from a horror perspective with the blood in the water. And man, and Matt Reeves actually did a really good recreation of that scene too in Let Me In. And this is one of those endings that makes you think, but it's a gut punch of an ending, because you feel for her. I mean, you do. You feel for this character who has been trapped in the body of a 12-year-old for 100 years and who wants that connection that she has with this young boy, Eli. But realistically, she can't have it. You know, she can't do anything but kill and feed and do it all over again, unless she wants to just be gone forever. My number 3 is The Lost Boys from 1987. Guys, directed by Joel Schumacher. I was 12 years old when this came out, which is also when I saw it, which was probably a little too young to see it at the time, but I did, so who cares? My dad was parent of the year. He let me see this thing. This was probably the coolest the vampires had looked since I had seen Jerry Dandridge in Fright Night a couple years before. And not only that, there was multiple of them. This was a band of cool vampires, dudes that you wanted to ride down on the strip with on your motorcycle or whatever, listening to these shirtless dudes playing saxophone on the pier. I mean, that's fucking beautiful. You know, it's been memed to death right now, but if you saw this in the 80s at 12 years old, you were affected. If you were a young boy, you were like, man, I want to be a vampire. That's what this movie did for me. You know, it does come with its level of scares and fright too, but it's more so just this hip kind of almost like The Outsiders type of film, but with vampires in it. So it does have that like trying to fit in with your group of popular high school kids. And Schumacher made it such a cool phenomenon in the late 80s. Like, this movie still lives on as one of the greats in the vampire genre. Also, I'll just tell you right now, Jamie Gertz in this movie, meow. All right, here we go, guys. It was my number 1 movie of the year last year, 2024's Nosferatu, directed by Robert Eggers, is my number 2. I spent months talking about this movie from like December until like February, up until the Oscars. I mean, you know, you've heard me talk about it on this channel before. Lily Rose Depp turns in as Ellen. There's no way you're not going to tell me that was an Oscar-worthy performance. One of the 5 best performances of the year last year. Definitely better than somebody that was in Amelia Perez. Nicholas Hoult is charming as all get out in this movie. And Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok. Man, talk about embodying a character and just creating this like sensual aura of dread. It was like psychotically sexy and eerily creepy, and always making you feel like he's right around the corner, regardless if he was or not. Almost like he was feeling whatever negative space was there, because his presence never left the proceedings once you kind of got to know it. And then the way the film was shot is uncanny. I mean, I know it was in the mix for cinematography last year, production design, and man, it was deserved. The film is so authentic and so beautiful, and Eggers has a knack for that really with all his films. And you know, the ending of this film is haunting. You know, it's haunting and beautifully done. It's an ending that we all know if we know the original Nosferatu, or even Dracula for that matter. But Eggers brings something more visually and artistically to it. And it's literally like an oil painting that you would see in a museum at the end of that movie for like 10 seconds. The overhead shot of Ellen and Warlock, and you know, Willem Dafoe's there in the room. I mean, it's a beautiful film. And I'm talking about from the craft and the way it looks, but it's also just a perfect recreation, modernization of a classic story in Nosferatu. It's my runner-up. And my number 1 has to be without a doubt. And I actually was wondering if Nosferatu was going to kind of leapfrog it after seeing it last year, but I am not able to do that yet because I just rewatched this a few weeks ago, and god damn it, it's still my number one. I don't know if it'll ever be dethroned. It is Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992. Guys, you know, I was talking about how influential a movie like The Lost Boys was on a 12-year-old. When I saw this movie, I was a rising senior in high school, and this one was even more influential in terms of my horror affinity. After seeing Bram Stoker's Dracula and a couple other movies from the early to mid-90s, was when I became a horror guy. Now that's self-proclaimed, but nonetheless, it became my favorite genre of film, and I attribute really this movie to my kind of like, okay, that's what I am now. Goth horror dude. Thank you, Francis Ford Coppola. And Gary Oldman, okay, I know he won his Academy Award portraying Winston Churchill. I talked about that recently on a video I did. That's not his best performance, okay? This one might be his best performance as Dracula, as the titular character. First of all, he's playing such an iconic figure from literature, movies, whatever. And he's like, okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that the way I want to do that. And that's what he does. I mean, does he borrow from like Christopher Lee and some of the other greats? Yes. But this is Gary Oldman's portrayal. And, you know, looking at an actor like Gary Oldman in 92, you wouldn't look at him and go, oh, that guy should play Dracula. I mean, even if you look at Christopher Lee at that age and you put them next to each other, even Christopher Lee looks a little more like, okay, he could probably woo some ladies. You're not necessarily saying that about Gary Oldman, but then you see him in this role and you're like, fucking bite me, dude. Like, yes, let's go, dude. Winona Ryder, guys, as Mina in this movie, and coupled with Edward Scissorhands, which came out the same year. It's a crush I haven't gotten over, guys. I've lived with that crush for 30 years, and I'm still on it. I love Winona Ryder. It is a great, great film that will live on forever for me. It's in my top 25 or so films of all time, period. So I knew it was going to be my number one vampire movie. Bram Stoker's Dracula with the incomparable Gary Oldman in the lead role. And for my money, by the way, and I am counting Skarsgård and Christopher Lee and all the others we've mentioned, for my money, Gary Oldman's portrayal of Dracula is the best one that character has gotten in movies. That's just me. I'm just putting that out there. It's just my thing. It's my opinion. Everybody remain calm. Guys, sorry about the Coke bottle glasses during the majority of that video. I can't see anything. My pink eye's, you know, healing or whatever. This is the best I've been in a few days, but I wanted to get this video recorded so I can edit it for you and hopefully get it out before the weekend. I love you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. What did you think of my list of my favorite vampire movies? What is your favorite vampire movie? Please let me know down in the comments, because maybe there's one I didn't mention that I need to watch or rewatch or wasn't familiar with. And, you know, in my list, I hope if you guys seek ones out that you haven't seen, you'll start with Thirst and then A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. Those two in particular, I feel like are vastly underseen. If you love the vampire subgenre, then you need to give those ones a look for sure. But let me know what you thought of my list down below in the comments. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll see you out here next time in the garage.